So this is the third of these 3 lectures that I've given, and insofar as they've had a kind of connecting thread, that thread has been this Romance literature that Icelanders get into writing around the 14th century. They get started a bit earlier than that, but it really takes off as a genre in the 14th century. By Romance, I mean kind of stories that usually involve knights. The plot is driven by a need to get married, and the story will end with a wedding. That's how medieval romance works, and it's a literary form that kind of underpins the novel in many ways, and kind of Hollywood movies in many ways. It's quite different, of course, from these kind of classical Icelandic sagas, which are kind of long, really complex, really subtle, I mean amazing literature, and set on Iceland, which are all about kind of family feuds and settlement and stuff. These romances work in really different ways. And something else that John and I were very keen to kind of bring into this series is kind of Iceland now. Mostly outside Iceland, people kind of come to Icelandic language and literature through the Middle Ages. That's how I came to it. That's why I've been mostly talking about medieval stuff. But you wouldn't want Iceland to just vanish into the kind of 13th century, never to return. And we're very proud at Leeds of the fact that we do teach modern Icelandic, one of only 2 universities in Britain so to do. So I wanted to kind of connect this medieval stuff with Iceland now. And there's nothing more now about Iceland than the financial crisis and its ongoing ramifications. I mean, maybe a year ago we thought it would be almost over, but, this story just keeps going, not just in Iceland, but with the Euro crisis, America's recession starting to bring Canada down, even though you're all really well behaved. So it's just a really kind of big issue for us. If I use the word kreppa during this, it's because I've slipped into using the Icelandic term for the crash, the kreppa, which kind of means a flash flood. I want to talk about Sigurðar Saga Fóts, which is a 14th century saga. Here's an illustration of it that was done in about 1968. And this new novel, Sigurðar Saga Fóts, which came out just last year, completely by coincidence, me and some students were involved in translating the medieval one. This poor refugees. Have the stool. Yeah, I don't need the stool. Yeah, there you go. Brilliant. Oh, and then whoever's on the stool will be really high up as well. That'll be exciting. So I was translating this saga in collaboration with lots of my students. The main reason why we went for Sigurðar Saga Fóts was that no one had translated it before, so I knew that I could assess them on something that they couldn't just kind of go and nick a translation from somewhere else. And it's really short. It's only about 4,000 words. It's not one of these kind of whopping kind of saga-sized sagas. That's kind of characteristic that I'll come back to a bit later. But we were just kind of going away at that, and at the same time it so happened that Bjarni Harðarson was publishing this novel, which he calls an endurgerð of the saga. An endurgerð is a remake. So he kind of has this novel about the crisis, the kreppa, which he sees as a remake of the old Sigurðar Saga Fóts, the saga of Sigurd foot, or leg, if you prefer. So what I'm going to try and do is to give you a sense of what the medieval text is about, but also to bounce it off this novel from last year, and to use this as a way to explore how Icelanders are dealing with financial crisis, the sort of situation their country's found itself in. Artistic responses to the financial crisis strikes me as a kind of really interesting topic that it's worth kind of getting into now rather than kind of waiting for 20 years for the dust to settle. Most countries have produced documentaries about the ongoing financial crises around the world, but I haven't found that many kind of artistic responses. And artistic responses are potentially important and worthwhile. They can engage people who are otherwise going to struggle to think about these phenomenally complex and abstract issues, and bring them into a kind of debate that we all need to be having at the moment about how economy and state and people should interact. And artistic works can allow people to kind of explore possibilities that just wouldn't be appropriate to the genre of the documentary, say, or the kind of Treasury report or whatever. Britain has produced a few such works, but Iceland, proportionally to its kind of population, is doing really well. This is actually a British play, Enron. It did very well in Britain. It went to Broadway and kind of had a kind of creppa, I suppose. That was a bit unfortunate for them. But it was also translated quite swiftly into Icelandic. This play wasn't written as a commentary on the financial crisis. It just so happened that it came out at just the right time for the story of Enron to kind of suddenly be the story of everyone. So it was swiftly translated into Icelandic, put on at the Borgarleikhúsið, the city theatre in Reykjavik, and they've done quite a lot of interesting stuff. Most prominently, last year, one of the big reports about the financial crisis came out, and the Borgarleikhúsið kind of cancelled its repertoire for 4 days, got all their actors, 45 of them, to just in turn read out the report. It was televised, and bits of it were televised, and they kind of put it through on the internet for everyone to watch. And just for 4 days, solid, they read out the report. I mean, it's not like... I mean, citizens were invited to go and listen, right? But it's more the act of saying, we're looking, we're noticing, that was important. So there's been some quite interesting theatre relating to this. Some interesting books as well. Bókasafn Huldar. I mean, I didn't do a specific trawl for this. I mean, I just found this in a shop and I was like, oh, I like the look of that one. I'll read that. Granny Huld's Library. There's Granny Huld with her cigar. She's a troll. It's set in a dystopian future where the kind of world is ruled by a bank and children's parents kind of get taken as collateral for their loans. In some ways it's not a great novel, right? But in other ways it's doing really important work. It's kind of taking 10-year-olds and saying to them, here's compound interest. Someone kind of needs to be doing that, I suppose. It's been translated into Danish. I don't know if it's made it into any other languages yet. Just a couple of other examples before we come to this novel. A couple of concept albums. Don't think the English-speaking world, if you correct me, I'd be really grateful. I've seen a few folk songs come out relating to the crash, but I haven't seen any concept albums on the subject yet. Skrítin Veröld, musically it's just meat and two veg, but the words are very witty. All sorts of kind of songs about what it's like to be one of the riot police in Iceland when you're having your first riot for 55 years. What it's like to be a banker who's given all of his money to his wife, all the real money, so that the state can't take it off him when everything goes belly up. Helvítis Fucking Funk is a sort of instrumental album, but it draws on the music of, for example, Fela Kuti from Nigeria, very famous political commentator there, and kind of transfers it to an Icelandic setting. I don't really need to translate, the phrase that this is picking up on is Helvítis fucking fuck, which was coined by an Icelandic comedian, and it just doesn't need translating, really. He's got a very nice sketch from about 2008 that shows this kind of well-mannered, kind of cardigan-wearing old man trying to work out how to express the situation he's found himself in. He struggles for ages, and eventually the best he can come up with is just Helvítis fucking fuck. And it became a kind of catchword overnight. Oh, I seem to have scared that gentleman off. Poor chap. Jon Gnarr, the comedian behind this is going somewhere. This is quite an important example for what's going to come later. Jon Gnarr, the comedian behind the phrase that's picked up on in the album, became very prominent in Icelandic politics. He was so frustrated with the situation that he founded the Best Party. The name obviously paid off. He was elected as Reykjavik's mayor. He's wound up in the kind of odd situation both of trying to twin Reykjavik with Moomin Valley. It's one of his kind of acts as Reykjavik's mayor. It's kind of comedian mayor that they now have. And also trying to sort out the fact that Reykjavik Energy was privatised, except that the state remained liable for all its debts, the stupidest kind of privatisation you can ever imagine, and is now totally struggling to kind of carry over its massive loans, which are worth some ridiculous proportion of Iceland's GDP. So part of the point that kind of Jon Gnarr makes here is that fact in Iceland at the moment is often stranger than fiction. And it's quite weird for writers of fiction to be trying to come to this situation and say, write satire about a place where really you just need to kind of put the people up and show what they're saying, to satirise what they're saying. It's such a kind of extraordinary place, an extraordinary kind of set of circumstances. Cool. So this hopefully kind of gives us some context to what Icelanders are doing culturally to deal with and respond to the crash. What I'm now going to go back to is the 14th century. I'd like to talk to you about the saga, give you some sense of how these romances are working in 14th century Iceland, and then we'll think about what Bjarni Harðarson, this novelist, has done with this material. So if you're basically a medievalist, right, this is the bit where you can wake up again. The prize for the longest author name list in the whole of Old Norse studies at the moment, if you find one that beats it, let me know and I'll add some more authors onto this. But here's the saga that I said me and some of these students of mine wound up translating. Do I want to do this one first? I'll give you a bit of. No, I'll start with this slide over here. Yeah, seems to be 14th century, maybe mid 15th. It's actually very hard to date this stuff. I often say it's 14th century, which is just kind of a broad way of saying we're not sure, but it generally works. These are sagas that Sigurðar Saga Fóts draws on, so it's borrowing from those literary texts. And these are just a few of the texts that it subsequently influences. So it's very engaged with its literary environment. It's drawing on other material, and other people are reading it and kind of doing stuff with it. I said it's short, and these romance sagas usually are shorter than the kind of famous Icelandic sagas. But this is particularly dinky. It's about 4,000 words. And it's a bit of a funny text. It doesn't really give itself space for much characterisation. The plot's a bit kind of jumpy. I don't think it's a great saga. The main reason why we translated it is that it's short. Maybe that's the main reason why Bjarni used it as his kind of inspiration for this novel. I wouldn't dare comment. But at the same time, because it's so short, it's sort of romance saga concentrated. It fits in a lot of what these sagas are really about in a kind of unusually bald sort of way. So although I don't think it's a great work of literature, I do think it's quite an interesting text for thinking about how Icelandic romance works. If you actually want to read a really good romance, Saga Gautrekssonar, up there, that's been translated. That's a really nice one. Hermann Paulsson did a translation of that. Hjartmann Svagok Hermann, so I mentioned that when I was talking about elves. I'm translating it at the moment, along with some of my students, so eventually that will come out. That's a nice one too. So what happens in this saga? As I say, these sagas are fundamentally about getting married. You've got this guy, Sigurðar Fótur. Let's find out what he's like. This just gives you a sense of the kind of tone that these texts have. We'd call them kind of popular romances in a kind of more general European setting. There was a king called Sigurðar who ruled France. Icelandic romance is always set outside Iceland. Romance doesn't happen in Iceland in terms of literary genre. That's not quite true, but it's broadly true. He was a young and unmarried man, and he had newly taken up his patrimony after his father, King Hringur. Sigurðar was a generous and noble king, stern and a great warrior, and a man so valiant with arms that few or none could stand against him, either in battle or in single combat. So this is the kind of world we're moving in, right? It's about violence. It's also about kind of valiance, about kind of excessive characteristics. It's slightly different from the more restrained tone of the sagas that are set on Iceland. That same summer that was just mentioned, I'll tell you about that in a moment, King Sigurðar went out raiding. Any pirates who heard about him fled before him because he was extremely famous for his raiding and his chivalry. For it was said truly of Sigurðar that he was a man of greater skill than any other at that time. He was so quick and nimble-footed that he neither leapt up more slowly nor lower in the air, landing backwards on only one foot, than the most valiant people on both feet forwards. Because of this, he was called Sigurðar Foot. This characteristic is completely irrelevant in the saga. I'm going to come back in due course to whether this is a satirical text. I can't make up my mind. It might actually be a text that is taking the piss out of the romance genre, or it might just be a really bad romance, with no allusions to Lady Gaga intended. There's this other guy, Ásmundur. While Sigurðar is out raiding, Ásmundur goes and visits this king who has a daughter called Signy. He's like, wow, Signy, I really like you. Could we get married? She's like, I'd like to marry you too, Ásmundur, but unfortunately my dad's not here and I need to check with him. Ásmundur's like, well, okay, I'll be back in the autumn and we'll get married then. Meanwhile, the king meets Sigurðar, and Sigurðar, sorry, too many Icelandic sounds there, is like, hey, could I marry your daughter? The king's like, no problem, you'd be a great match. So we set up this situation where two guys are going to compete for the same girl. Girl's not happy, but she goes with her dad's decision, as girls kind of are supposed to do in medieval Iceland. At the wedding, however, where Sigurðar is due to marry Signy, all the lights go out in the hall. It's slightly more complicated than that, but it will do for now. All the lights go out, and when they come back on, after a lot of kind of crockery has been broken, the girl is gone. Sigurðar chases after Ásmundur, eventually catches up with him, and Ásmundur's like, dude, you really don't want to fight me. And Sigurðar's like, I really do. And Ásmundur's like, no, really, you don't. And Sigurðar's like, yeah, I do. And so they have this massive fight, and Ásmundur totally wins. Doesn't kill Sigurðar, but kind of nurses him back to health. And then in a really weird kind of plot development that you don't see elsewhere, and is handled very abruptly in the saga, Ásmundur is like, well, since you've tried so hard, you can have the girl. And yeah, that's what happens. What this lays bare in ways that other sagas don't, but it's a theme that's implicit in those other sagas, is what it's saying is the girl's less important than the relationship between these guys. Okay, so the saga's basically sending the message that, you know, girls are kind of useful pawns, you know, kind of handy for moving around society and stuff. But what's really important is relationships between men and making those relationships work. And that idea is implicit in loads and loads of this romance literature, which is often blatantly misogynistic. There are some interesting exceptions to this, but that theme is fairly prominent. At the same time, in this saga, the girl seems to be the most sensible character at various stages, so that might be a kind of commentary on this situation. Ásmundur is now in need of a bride because he's just given up another one. So he goes off to Ireland, where he's heard there's a beautiful girl called Elína, and things go dramatically wrong for him, as we find out back in the bed of Sigurðar and Signy. I want to kind of focus on this little bit of text to give you a sense of the possible lameness of this text, or the possibility that it is actually being satirical. If it is being satirical, I don't think this is ever going to make it as a kind of great work of satire, but it might be quite sophisticated, and I genuinely can't make up my mind. And I would welcome you to go and read the translation or the original and see what you think. In any case, one night the queen was very restless in her sleep, so that she was writhing almost from head to toe. So the king thought about, this is Sigurðar, the king thought about waking her, but nothing came of it. But afterwards she woke of her own accord. She was then sweating and worn out and very red in the face. The king asked what she dreamt, and she replied, I thought I saw King Ásmundur of Húnaland, that's this guy Ásmundur, sailing to Ireland. But when he arrived, I thought I saw a terrible bull charge against him and his men, with such a huge pack of wolves that I couldn't see beyond them. And they all attacked Ásmundur and his men. And it seemed to me that the fight ended with the wolves tearing all Ásmundur's men to death, except for him and Ólafur, who's a friend, alone. And the last I saw of them, they were in the power of that huge bull. And then I woke up. What do you suppose, said King Sigurðar, that this dream would mean? I mean, there might be a couple of details missing, but Sigurðar doesn't come across as the brightest light in the harbour here. On the other hand, it's a really kind of lame dream vision. I mean, really good dream visions in sagas, and there are lots of them, are baffling and elusive enough to sound like a real dream, and there's a kind of genuine sense of uncertainty about what those dreams might mean, which opens up all sorts of interesting situations for plot, characterisation, how people are kind of dealing with their situations in their world. This is a really kind of obvious dream, and then this king is like, I don't get it. So maybe this is a satire. Okay, maybe this is actually saying these characters are really stupid. The girl goes on to kind of explain at great length to Sigurðar what this must mean, actually filling in quite a lot of the plot for the audience in doing so, and then telling him that he really ought to go and help his friend. So she does come across as fairly sensible. I don't know, but it might just be a rubbish text. So I want to kind of keep that problem in view, and it's one that I'll come back to. The idea of dreams is very prominent in Icelandic discourse at the moment about the time before the kreppan, before the crash. The idea that everyone was living in a dream, all that credit that they had access to was just dream money. It wasn't real. That album Skrítin Veröld starts with a kind of song about dreams. So that's a theme that's going to kind of echo as the lecture goes on as well. It turns out that Ásmundur has gone to Ireland, And he has a big fight with the King of Ireland, who has his daughter, and loses and is imprisoned. I won't go through all of this text. What I'd like to emphasise is the massive slaughter that is involved in this battle. This is a genre feature of these Icelandic romances, but it's going to be kind of interesting for thinking about the financial crash as well. Ásmundur attacked very well. He went right through the army of the Irish king 8 times and cleared a path as broad as his sword point reached. And he killed so many people that it would be a long job to list their names. And it goes on in this vein for quite a while. So you get the idea of the peasantry, right, just being slaughtered everywhere, all to make these characters look kind of cool. And it's not clear, again, whether we're supposed to go, yeah, that's what peasants are for. And genuinely, that might be the kind of attitude that's implied. And we do this in Hollywood movies all the time now, right? People die all over the shop and we don't mind. They're just the minions of the bad guy. Or maybe we are supposed to kind of look at this with a degree of horror. It's a bit hard to decide. So we've got these violent texts with women kind of being shuffled around a bit like objects, but at the same time seemingly a bit more witty than their male counterparts. And a kind of theme that's fundamentally about getting married. That's kind of Sigurðar Saga fóts in a nutshell. Oh, eventually Sigurðar comes, rescues Ásmundur from prison. Oh yeah, and I'll come on to what happens later at that point. So let's now look at Bjarni Harðarsson's rewriting of this, Sigurðar Saga fóts, the 2010 version. He does not take the plot of the Icelandic saga and repopulate it with 21st century Iceland. It's not really a rewriting. What he does is take the known real stories of 21st century Iceland, well, 20th and 21st century Iceland, and just give them a kind of smattering of romance saga-ness. He borrows some of the names, he plays with some of the ideas from Sigurðar Saga, and he kind of lifts little quotations from it to start his chapters and stuff like that. The real kind of meat of his narrative comes from these two. None of his characters, as far as I can tell, is a real Icelander. But the characters seem to be made up of stories kind of borrowed from various different Icelanders. One of the key figures in the novel is, well, Bjarni Kaupahjörðin Jónsson, that's the name of the character, who's based on Björgólfur Guðmundsson. Has anyone heard of him? You might not have. In Britain, many people would have, because he owned West Ham, the football team, for a good while. Owned, right? I mean, it's not like he had any of the money that he bought it with. But there you go, that's how credit works. And so he was the chairman of West Ham United for a bit. And he's got this son, who comes out in the novel as Sigurðar Fritz Bjarnhéðinsson, but it's actually Björgólfur Thor Björgólfsson. And they're now in big trouble. Well, let's do it. Let's do it the novel way rather than the real life way. Like I said, for our characters, but our characters don't exactly live their lives. The way the novel works is that Bjarnhéðinn is this kind of 2-bit Icelandic businessman who kind of sort of gets lucky more or less by chance. He's also an alcoholic, but somehow he manages to get a little chain of floristry shops. They sell flowers. He doesn't know anything about flowers, but he seems to own this little chain of shops. Well done, Björgólfur. I mean, well done, Bjarnhéðinn. And unfortunately, the business kind of keeps afloat, but at the same time, behind the scenes, it's all going pear-shaped. He's got no idea how to run anything. His son, after a period working as a kind of rock band promoter, which also involves a sideline kind of importing small amounts of cocaine inside the drums or whatever, he then gets busted. His son, after a period of unemployment following this, joins his dad working for the company and arrives and just realises it's in a total state. He's like, I'm now a partner in this company. I've got no real money to speak of. This is a total mess. I don't know what I'm going to do. He's very depressed. But to his amazement, this bank come along and say, yeah, we think your company should buy this enormous Norwegian thing. And Sigurðar is like, but we've got no money. We're in debt. How the hell can we do that? And the bank's like, no, that's the point. You don't need money to buy stuff. It's called leveraging. I struggle with this in Icelandic, right? I mean, it's quite hard vocabulary for me. So the ins and outs of this are quite kind of hazy and complicated anyway. But by this weird set of circumstances, they become these incredibly powerful businessmen. And then when the state decides to privatise its banks, did anyone come to the lecture a couple of years ago? Well, John will have, of course. I wrote down his name, but if I get it out of here, I'll rattle. It's really bad. It's the economics lecture. Thorvaldur Gylfason. You're welcome to stand or to sit on the floor. There's a yoga mat somewhere. Or Courtney can give up the high seat. Now that's impressive. Cool. Some of you will have heard Thorvaldur's lecture, which I kind of listened to on the MP3s, and he emphasises that when, for example, Estonia came out of the Soviet Union and they were like, we've got to find someone to run these banks, the Estonians were like, OK, we don't know how to do it, we'll invite foreign investment. And Estonia's banks are now mostly owned by different Nordic countries, and that's fine. Estonia's doing incredibly well. In the Iceland of the novel and in real life, Iceland was like, well, our boys should keep, and that strákarnir okkar, our boys, is also the term they use for the football team. Our boys should be in control of the banks. And these two wind up just being given this bank. And it kind of all goes wrong from there. So, like I say, Bjarni takes more or less a real-life story. Like I say, fact is stranger than fiction. It's hard to satirise the kind of crazinesses that were going on in sort of early 21st century Iceland. But Bjarni kind of uses that to kind of build this kind of comic, kind of farcical story that I actually also find quite tragic and dark in ways that I'll kind of unpack in a bit. This is partly a way of unpacking the darkness, I suppose. It's also one of the interesting things that the novel does, which real life can't quite do, to explore possibilities that are out there. You're all going to read that, aren't you? So maybe I'll just put the pictures back for a moment. Sigurðar is sent off on a business mission to talk to some people in Turkmenistan. He's like, all right then, whatever you say. He happens to know German. That's quite useful because the guy in Turkmenistan is half German, half Russian. And he's having this weird conversation with this guy, and he's like, I don't get why we should invest in what you're doing, why we should loan you money, how you're going to have anything to do with our shares. He's having trouble keeping up with the plot, which is how his life works generally at this stage in the story. I mean, everything that's going on he knows is madness, but at the same time he's caught up in it by this weird process of just politeness, courtesy, which is something that the saga talks about a bit and perhaps reflects these romances in the Middle Ages. This weird combination of just politeness and desperation. And he's talking to this guy, and he's like, I just don't get what's going on. And this guy, Keks, this dodgy German-Russian guy in Turkmenistan, says, not a word, in his hard North German. You people think that we own nothing, are nothing, and can be nothing. But I will tell you what we have, my friend. We have flowers in Afghanistan, but not a word. Not a word. And okay, hopefully this doesn't need too much unpacking, but like if you've got poppies, that's where they grow poppies, right, Afghanistan, then you can make heroin. And this is a subtext, more or less, in the novel. It surfaces into the main story just a couple of times, but it really defines what happens to Sigurðar next. Once he's got this stuff deep under lots of layers of different deals and businesses and stuff, once this stuff is underpinning his bank, he knows that his head is on the line, quite literally. One of the guys who he gets sent off to Turkmenistan with returns to Iceland as dog food in a large wooden box, accompanied by the wallet and the fillings. And I read this, and I'm like, oh, this is nasty. Sigurðar tries to laugh about it with his mates, but they don't sleep well that night. I sort of thought this was nasty but implausible, but actually, I mean, The Guardian did run an article in 2005 about how the business of these two, what's the name of their beverage company? Baltic, yeah, it's Baltic, which became a big drinks company in Russia, was kind of based in all the places where you'd be expecting mafia activity. Drinks is apparently a big mafia kind of industry in Russia. One of their managing directors was indeed assassinated. According to this Guardian article, I haven't actually found other evidence of this. I've got to ask Russian friends to kind of look at the Russian newspapers online to follow this up. But at any rate, whether it's true or not, Bjarni has picked up on this idea, right? And because he's writing fiction, it's not libelous, exactly, he's able to explore this idea that part of what's going on in our financial crisis is the drugs trade, far underneath. Don't know what you think about the drugs trade. It's not really my point. My point is the importance of fiction to allow us to think about what's going on in ways that the Treasury report can't. In a way, this sets up Sigurðar as a fundamental villain who we shouldn't care about, who doesn't care about other people. But in another way, at least in my reading, it really helps us to sympathise with him. This is the first moment, really, in all his kind of banking career where he's like, oh, there's an actual product that people actually want. Okay, right, finally, I understand that there's some genuine capitalism going on here. And he's really quite relieved in an odd sort of way. It's also business he kind of understands from his kind of previous life. And, I mean, you can unpack that in various ways. I'm not going to get into a kind of drugs liberalisation debate here. But it's a way of kind of communicating to us partly Sigurðar's desperation and partly the kind of madness of the world he lives in. Cocaine is a more sensible product, heroin is a more sensible product to be selling than just this invented credit and derivatives that he's actually kind of carting around the world that are even now causing enormous kind of strife around the world. Finally, he's actually talking to someone who understands business. And that idea that we can start to identify with Sigurðar through this and other factors is one that's going to be quite important, and I'm kind of going to end on. Let's pop back to the saga for a minute and reflect these flowers in Afghanistan off Sigurðar Saga Fóts, the 2010 version. We're in Ireland. Sigurðar has rescued Ásmundur after that big old battle where all the people died and everything. And they're now kind of brokering a deal with the King of Ireland, Hrólfr, the guy who's got the daughter Elína. And you know, Hrólfr is just kind of chained up at this point. So what happens? After that, Ásmundur asked how Sigurðar intended to deal with King Hrólfr, and King Sigurðar replied, "The life of King Hrólfr and Elína, his daughter, all Ireland and France, are now in your power and at your disposal." So good kind of kingly, magnanimous measures there from Sigurðar. Ásmundur thanked him for all his words, very courteous, very polite kind of text, as did everyone else. "And I want to ask King Hrólfr this," said Ásmundur, "whether he wishes to marry his daughter Elína to me now, rather than fighting a great big battle." Then King Hrólfr replied, "I most certainly want to do that, and will do so in order to win my life." Well, you would, wouldn't you? It's not necessary to make a long tale of this. It was decided that Ásmundur would marry Elína, and the wedding was immediately prepared. King Hrólfr paid his own daughter's bride price. That's a sum of money that the husband normally gives to the bride that she keeps in the event of a divorce. But in this case, the father actually pays it up. He paid his own daughter's bride price in a noble fashion with gold and precious things. They parted now with friendship. Bjarni's point, I think, amongst other things, in using this saga as a way to kind of write his own novel, is that these guys, these heroes of the Icelandic past, are also racketeers, right? You chain a guy up, you say, okay, well, we'll kill you, or you'll let us marry your daughter, by the way, at your own expense. So I think Bjarni is reading this narrative as a satire of Vikings, a satire of medieval violence, and Bjarni is saying to us, yeah, that's what Icelanders have become like these racketeers. Whether we should read the saga as a satire like that, I'm really not sure. It might be that we just have to read this deadpan that medieval Icelanders are sitting there going, yeah, brilliant, Ásmundur, you know, you've won. I'm so in two minds about that text. Many of you will have encountered this idea of útrásarvíkingar, but I want to kind of make sure that it's clear and sort of in the picture as I kind of draw this analogy between Bjarni's novel and the medieval saga. Útrásarvíkingar means raiding Vikings. Icelanders didn't used to think of themselves as Vikings particularly. When we think about medieval Scandinavia, right, we use the word Viking all the time. You kind of put it in a course title so that students know that it's about medieval Scandinavia. We use it in popular culture all the time. But Icelanders now think of their medieval past basically as about settlement. It's not about Vikings or raiding or piracy particularly. It's about settling Iceland. That's been their narrative. But then in the 90s and the early 21st century, this idea that Icelanders are actually Vikings started to become prominent as Icelandic business kind of took off. This is a speech by Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, the president of Iceland, about how to succeed in modern business, lessons from the Icelandic voyage. It's actually given, in London, to actual rich, important, powerful people in 2005, so before the crash. And it's just a phenomenal document, right? This is one of these things where you don't need to satirise anything. You just read it and you laugh or you weep. It is indeed. It's an amazing guide to how to succeed in modern business, lessons from Iceland. It's a list of everything you shouldn't do, as we've now discovered. Here's the 8th part of his list. The heritage of discovery and exploration fostered by the medieval Viking sagas that have been told and retold to every Icelandic child. This is a tradition that gives honour to those who venture into unknown lands. I'm doing this in quite a dramatic way. Olavur would be kind of mumbling this, as Icelanders do. This is a tradition that gives honour to those who venture into unknown lands, who dare to journey to foreign fields, interpreting modern business ventures as an extension of the Viking spirit, applauding the successful entrepreneurs as heirs of this proud tradition. So what Icelanders had come to do in the early 20th century was to take these sort of conventional medieval sagas, one set on Iceland, that mention kind of raiding in Britain and that kind of thing, and say, yeah, that's a model for us. That's us being cool. This is our special heritage that other people don't have. That's why we're rich. What Bjarni has done is to take a different genre of Icelandic literature, these wacky romances, which also talk about people going raiding and stuff, and to kind of use that to re-narrate the Icelandic situation as madness and as this fantasy world, a world of romance and France and knights and castles that wasn't really there, a great big dream. I'm going to finish with just a small point that kind of picks up on a small but I think important point that picks up on some criticism that was made of the British artistic responses to the financial crisis. Plays like Enron, and oh dear, I've forgotten the name of one that's commissioned by the National Theatre. That's annoying. Anyway, there's a couple of plays and a novel. And a sort of useful point was made about these, that they're good, they're informative, they're quite interesting and fun. But at the same time, you go and watch them and you kind of laugh at the fools who are on the stage, the people in Enron and all the rest. It sort of becomes too easy for us all to say, it's not our fault, it's the bankers. That's a problem in two ways. In one way, it kind of is everyone's fault. Everyone was buying crazy shares, buying houses they couldn't afford. Even if they were being missold by banks, we're all kind of involved in creating the mess that we're now in. And it's a problem in another way because it takes agency away from normal people. If we're trying to think what we should do about financial crisis, we can't just say, send the bankers to prison, then it'll be fine. It doesn't change the system. But if all you're looking at is the bankers on stage, then you can't really see any other way into it. Something that I think I see in Bjarni's novel is a very important aspect of Sigurðar's identity. Like his model, he's a descendant of a great, rich Icelandic aristocratic family of the 19th century. And that's where he gets his name Fritz that I used earlier, Sigurðar Fritz. But he's he's descended from a bastard scion of that family, so he's not actually considered legitimate by them. And he grows up as a working class boy. And the novel plays throughout the text with this working class identity and this aristocratic identity that he's got. And he calls himself Sigurðar Fóts as a kind of way of changing this name Fritz, which is very posh, into a kind of just normal, everyday sounding Icelandic name. And he finds himself moving from being a nice-ish working class lad to being this kind of aristocratic, celebrated figure in Iceland. And this is kind of picked up at his wedding, which is a marriage of convenience to another kind of aristocratic Icelander. It's nothing about love or even about sex. But Sigurðar does have a lady who's to become his concubine, currently his kind of girlfriend. And she stands up at this wedding to give a speech. This is how the speech goes. The foreign minister had given a moving speech in which he likened Sigurðar Fóts to the ancient Vikings, calling him a modern-day Viking raider. Next, the master of ceremonies had planned to give the word to the CEO of one of the oil companies, but then an impertinent tapping on a glass was heard, and at the end of the bridal couple's table stood Vala Mariudóttir in her black apron. Sigurðar's girlfriend has infiltrated the event by just getting on board as one of the staff. She's just standing there in her apron, And she now gives this speech. Ladies and gentlemen, Sigurðar and everyone. I can't translate this. Fyrir hönd means literally for a hand. That really means on behalf of, but she's also talking about the hand work that workers do, right? Fyrir hand, segir maður ekki þannig. Well, fyrir hönd. On behalf of, doesn't a man say it that way, like with a hand, by the hand? Yeah, by the hand or the spirit. Fyrir hönd eða önd. On behalf of the hand or the spirit of us employees, us other simple folk on the floor, by our men, Sigurðar, Fourteenth-century and Bjarthéðinn Kaupahéðinn. Sigurðar seems to us girls much greater than a Viking. For us, he's a knight. He's well and truly our knight on a white horse. And now, when he's getting married, it feels for us like we are all marrying him. And actually, maybe we are. So you should watch out, Ellam, dear, that's the wife. Because we've all fallen for him, and he knows it, my Sigurðar. She's not actually stopping the wedding. She's just getting her 5 minutes of fame. But in doing so, she kind of shows a working class narrative, or Bjarni through this character, shows us a working class narrative of these bankers. People who the working classes are aspiring to as well. People who become their knights in these kind of crazy romances. And so through Sigurðar, you can hate him, you can laugh at him in this novel, but you can also kind of feel how he does represent two chunks of a society. And the kind of massive dislocation that he experiences as he becomes a banker and starts to work with all these derivatives and stuff, gives us a sense of how we might relate, not that I'm particularly poor, I'm a lecturer, but how we broadly might relate to the financial crisis. These romances were being read by normal, everyday old Icelanders for centuries. We've got some idea of where they're coming from in the 14th century. These are some of the people who are writing the stuff. I talked about them on Friday. But we know that really normal, poor people were reading these romances right through Icelandic history. They're presumably kind of modelling themselves on these kind of knights in some kind of way. They thought they were good people to hear about. Vala's narrative is, to me, shockingly similar to much of the news reporting and the vox pops that were associated with a certain celebrity wedding in Britain earlier this year. I mean, it's a bit unnerving. So we can kind of see the working class desire to kind of be these white knights and see their place in this whole narrative of financial collapse. Maybe that helps us to read back to Sigurðar Saga fóts from the 14th century as well, and its possible ranges of meanings for the poor people who are listening to it, as well as the rich people. Thank you for your attention, and if you've got any questions, I'll be glad to take them.
Just if I may, the last line of her speech at the wedding.
Yeah.
She also sent the signal when the last two words is my.
For sure, totally. So in a way, right, this speech is her just responding to the fact that her bloke is getting married to this girl for business purposes, and it's her kind of negotiating that situation, and it helps the audience to go, Sigurðar, what are you doing? Yeah, so I completely agree with that aspect of her speech as well. You know, that's all there too. But hopefully you're okay with the idea that it is also a kind of working class voice kind of coming through. Yeah.
It seems to me that in olden days, raiding parties, you got on the expedition and you went, you'd win or lose or drown at sea. And in the modern context, people didn't understand. Icelanders, for example, didn't understand that they were part of the raiding party.
Right.
And they could win or lose or drown in financial debt.
Right.
And the same for us. But that I see as an interesting difference between.
Yeah. That's a fantastic observation that I hadn't thought through, but I completely agree. I mean, one of the fundamental issues that we've all got to be dealing with at the moment is our failure to kind of assess risk leading up to the financial crisis. everyone was failing to assess risk, at the top of society, at the bottom. Whereas, in those Íslendinga sögur, the ones that are actually about Icelanders, the kind of more serious, highly serious, sort of hard-headed ones, there's a really apparent sense of risk. I think that's a really nice idea. Not yet convinced that I believe it, but I'm really looking forward to thinking about it. Thanks ever so much. Don't feel... is that okay?
So you need to know that the local team is called the Vikings, right? The Victoria unit.
Really?
For a time,
Oh, see, right, yeah.
although they weren't officially called it, the women's teams were called the Vikettes, which is bizarre, it seems to me. But it suggests, it could provide you a word for these sort of Frenchified Viking stories.
Wow, and that's one of Vala's later criticisms of Sigurðar, actually. I mean, he likes to just walk around like wearing jeans and a leather jacket, but as his career progresses, people keep dressing him in more and more fancy clothes. He loses his own self-image. I mean, it's a really sad thing to read about. He loses his own identity as people just put identities onto him. At the end of the novel, he actually kind of does okay. He escapes Iceland, he escapes arrest, he makes it to the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan, and he just becomes a blacksmith and learns the language and gets a wife and eventually dies. And he sort of finds a kind of happiness, having escaped from this dream, this nightmare that he's been living through. It's frequently referred to as a nightmare. But when he's getting dressed up in all this wacky, fancy stuff, as far as he perceives it, Vala is just like, I mean, can I be going out with this guy anymore? Iceland's quite good at kind of gay rights, but at the same time they have got this sort of homophobic streak, and she's like, dude, you look so gay. Vikettes would be ideal. She'd have used that term in an eye blink, I think. That's quite appropriate. This gent seems to have a question, but no, it might be full time. It's probably the last one, though. Would that be about right? Yeah, go for it.
Regarding the medieval text, it seems completely ludicrous. What makes you think that it's not a satire?
Yeah, it's hard for me to not make it sound ludicrous, partly just because I like to kind of read out the stuff in such a kind of pompous voice. And it is ludicrous, but there's loads of ludicrous literature out there in the Middle Ages. And it's not, when you kind of read it and think about it, it's not particularly more ludicrous than a lot of, say, action movies, which I might watch and go, that movie's so bad it's good. I've kind of spent my life doing English degrees and stuff. But which loads of people are just like, yep, that's good old-fashioned entertainment. And they more or less accept those narratives as being legitimate narratives. Moreover, I genuinely think that the saga is quite badly told. I mean, it might just be that I'm not a good enough literary critic, right? The literary critic ought to be the author's best friend. But I often look at the saga and I'm just like, that looks a bit ridiculous, but at the same time, I also just don't think you're telling the story well. So maybe it's just someone who isn't doing a good enough job as he kind of tries to do this very compact, short saga of covering his tracks ideologically. And all that fundamental patriarchal sort of ideology, martial ideology that underpins both medieval society and in many ways ours, is just laid bare, kind of by accident. You're welcome, of course, to go and read it and make up your own mind. I think we probably have better stop. So you're welcome to talk to me afterwards if you want to.
I think we need to say thank you once again for very memorable.